Thank you, Noel. Of course, you're assuming that we haven't already given Eoin Lawler the exciting bits of our speeches before we got here today, but that's another story. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but generally I don't write speeches or scripts. I speak from notes and see what happens from there. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to start, I suppose, to make some enemies by insulting my hosts, although not too egregiously, I hope. But I've always been a bit perplexed by the MacGill summer school. I've never attended it, and obviously, like a lot of politicians, I read about it primarily in the newspapers. But it always had the sense of the political and media establishment talking to themselves, and that's certainly how it seemed from the outside. That you have a week in the year where a significant number of the political and media establishment troop up to Donegal, a county which for the remaining 51 weeks of the year they tend to forget, and pontificate on the good and the bad of our political debate. And my concern has always been that the sense I get, not from the discussions from the floor, because by and large the good people who attend don't get reported in the newspapers, it's those of us at the top table, but I've always had a sense that in fact the debate seems to be particularly narrow and at risk of offending people, particularly superficial, and Micheál Martin's confused and very contradictory intervention was a case in point, but I'll talk more about that before we finish. What I'd like to do, however, is first of all make a comment on the question we've been asked to demonstrate or to consider, because I think that demonstrates some of the concerns I have. And then I just want to make three general observations or three kind of sets of interventions that I think are certainly points I think are helpful in understanding where our politics in this small part of the world is currently at. We were asked to consider the fragmented political landscape. And obviously the implications of that was that that's a bad thing, that that's a problem. Because, of course, when our political landscape wasn't fragmented, things were so much better. We were asked to consider the importance and the need for stable and effective government, as if somehow those two things go together. We've had incredibly stable periods of government over the history of the state, in fact, most notably the 3 consecutive Fianna Fáil governments. But I don't think anybody at this point in our history would suggest that they were particularly effective. And I'm always nervous when I hear this word of hard choices. Because I'm not sure when people talk about hard choices, they really understand what that means, or in fact, hard choices being cutting carers allowance or the domiciliary care grant, or challenging, for example, bondholders and powerful interests in Brussels and Frankfurt over how to spend taxpayers' money. But for me, the most troubling part of the question that I've been asked to address was a line near the end of the paragraph that talked about street protest and the anarchic flouting of the law. Now, there's no doubt, and obviously this is a reference to some of the anti-water charge protests, that there have been disruptive protests. But the anarchic flouting of the law isn't some new phenomenon that arrived with austerity. And in fact, if you compare the cost of the boycott of water charges to the taxpayer in comparison to the anarchic flouting of the law by politicians and bankers and other interests in the lead-up to the financial crash, I think the cost of those floutings of the law to the taxpayer are much more significant. But the last line, preventing political instability and achieving better governance. And I'm all for better governance, and it's something I, like many politicians, argue for. But in fact, it's important for us, if we're going to start having a serious debate about what better governance looks like, to really understand the causes of the political instability that we currently experience, and not just here, but elsewhere. So what I want to do is take a step back, talk not so much about Ireland or Southern Ireland at all, but just make 3 observations about the state of politics in general, both Ireland, Europe and the wider world. And the first, I suppose, follows on from Teresa's presentation, which I've heard in the main before, and I have to say there's very little I would disagree with it. And it's important always to remember when we think about our political system that party political systems aren't forces of nature. They don't exist forever. They emerge at particular moments in history. They're shaped by the context and the actions of their participants. They enter various crises. Sometimes they recuperate and reform, but ultimately they will come to an end. Our own party political system, as we know, begins at an earlier stage in the 20th century. It has had several crises over its period, but there is a sense in which we could be entering a period where we're about to see our party political system here, across Europe and elsewhere, change fundamentally, and in my view, potentially change fundamentally for the better. Teresa's caution is right. That process is by no way certain. And as we've seen from previous crises of our party political systems, they sometimes can find ways of reconstituting themselves that actually keeps the status quo in place. So I won't be shouting "Viva la Revolution" either, but I will be looking for the opportunities that this current period operates. But the really important question, I suppose, is why are our systems in crisis and potentially, as that first graph Teresa showed, in some level of decline? And are we witnessing the end of that system? And in some senses, in the Irish case, it's important to understand what the two linchpins of that system have been over the last century. The first is Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil as the cross-party alliance that managed to govern this state for a disproportionate period of time in comparison to most of its European counterparts. And one of the most significant things of recent years is the dramatic decline in the role of Fianna Fáil as a hegemonic political power in the state. And notwithstanding recent opinion polls, it is still greatly diminished from where it was before. And whether Fianna Fáil and Micheál Martin understand it or not, their decision not to accept the offer of partnership government from Enda Kenny and Fine Gael is as much about preserving the party political system we've had up until now and Fianna Fáil's central role in it, as it has to do with wanting to keep election promises. The other linchpin of our system are the smaller parties, parties like mine or Dermot's, or smaller parties who say we don't accept the political and economic proposals of the centre-right, centrist parties of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and yet historically, for whatever reason, and we can debate those, end up propping up those administrations. And what's again distinct about our current political moment is the party who is now potentially in that position, which is Sinn Féin, to prop up the continuance of the centre-right coalitions, has refused to do so. And refused to do so because we do not believe it is in the best interests of either the electorate that we represent or indeed the state as a whole. So, in some senses, Micheál Martin's defence of the political centre in his speech last night, which I read this morning, is really actually a defence of the status quo. And it's a call to return to the post-crash political order, albeit presented as something very different from that. The real question, however, isn't just why or the nature of this crisis, but is really to understand why our political system is in crisis. And again, it's not just here. Almost every major EU member state, and indeed the US, has experienced its own variants of this. And it's important to acknowledge that that crisis started well before the crash of 2008. In fact, it started, in some senses, back in the 1970s and early 80s. And at its root is a social and economic policy consensus that has dominated most of the advanced democracies since the period of 70s and 80s, and has led, in my view, to such disastrous social and economic outcomes for increasing numbers of citizens. In the 1970s, we saw the collapse of the post-war social democratic consensus, primarily in those countries that experienced that consensus. And we had this thing called the fiscal crisis of the state. Declining levels of growth meant less and less states were able to afford the generous post-war welfare regimes that they had developed. And in turn, this led to declining levels of growth, again, primarily in the core states of Europe and the European Union. And faced with this particular crisis of that post-war model, the European Union was increasingly seen as the solution, the exit route out of the particular malaise. Initially, of course, it was Delors' social Europe, providing what people thought was an adequate mix of economic growth through greater liberalisation, but adequate protections for citizens through welfare states and workers' rights. But in fact, what we've seen since the 90s is that social European vision giving way to a much more liberalised Commission and European Union under Barroso. What that led to was greater levels of market liberalisation, particularly financial liberalisation and liberalisation of services, key developments which underpin the economic crisis that affected us and other Eurozone member states. An increasing disregard for social rights, and again, particularly in core European member states, where we've seen social welfare systems undermined and workers' rights and the rights of migrants and new communities attacked. And a badly designed currency union. And I think most economists, even economists who were in favour of the principle of economic and monetary union, acknowledge now in retrospect its design was particularly poor and built up enormous levels of problems for the future. And we've moved crucially from a tax state, the idea of the role of government being to levy taxes on citizens and spend those taxes in what it felt was the common good, to a debt state. A state in which the ability of government to intervene to tackle health, education, housing and crisis is actually determined by the levels of debt it carries, access to debt it carries. And increasingly citizens, in turn, their levels of prosperity are determined by access to credit. And the consequence of all of that has been a narrowing of the policy options available to governments, centre-right or centre-left, as they're increasingly constrained by the parameters of a social and economic model that they designed and they signed up to. And an EU storing up substantial economic and political crises, which we're now living through. Some people would have thought that the Celtic Tiger era appeared to kind of shelter this small and peripheral part of the European Union from those changes, but in fact it simply delayed their impact, and when they came, as we all know, to our great cost, it came with a great vengeance. So what we've got, and I suppose this is, in my view, the kind of economic and political context underlying much of what Teresa was outlining, is we have both a European Union and a Southern Ireland, or indeed an Ireland, of winners and losers, more so than at any other point in current history. We've seen an enormous shift in the balance of wealth and power from citizens to small interests. And I have to say, and this is, I suppose, what most struck me in Micheál Martin's confused intervention last night, that shift was created by the centre ground. That shift was created by the convergence of Christian democratic and social democratic parties around a policy and social and economic model at the centre that has reaped huge costs for ordinary citizens. And that has led to growing dissatisfaction. And this isn't a new thing. Anybody who looked and studied at the sociological underpinnings of the French and the Dutch rejections of the EU constitution, for example, back in 2005, could see the trend as it was developing, even before the crash. That those people who were losing, who were being excluded socially, economically and politically from the prevailing order, were voting against the status quo and against the establishment. And that has continued to define our politics since then. In the Eurozone periphery, we've seen the growth of the left in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy and Greece, with a whole variety of different results. And in the Eurozone core and the EU core, we've seen a rise of the xenophobic right, whether UKIP or the Front National or elsewhere. But both of those developments are part of the same trend. Increasing numbers of citizens are being left behind, and they recognise they're being left behind by the failures of the political centre, and they're fishing around trying to find some alternative. And again, when I revert back to the question we were asked to address, it talked about instability and anarchy. And there was almost a kind of a reference to that hysteria that I find elsewhere in sections of the liberal media, to the rise of populism, this frightening thing that seems to be the cause of all of our ills. And I was reminded of a very short and very provocative book by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière called Hatred of Democracy. And he looks at this in a French context post-2005. And he's asking, why is it that the liberal centre is so concerned, so frightened, so angry at these outpourings of popular opposition to the status quo? And he argues, probably deliberately provocatively, that at fundamental level it's a hatred of democracy. That the point at which those people who are excluded start to challenge the status quo, they themselves are presented as the problem. They themselves are presented as the cause of the difficulties of our political system, and that idea ran straight through all of Micheál Martin's observations last night. In my view, and it's not that I'm being blasé about extremism or dismissive of the threat of xenophobia, but the real issue is the demand of people for a break with the consensus, threatening the political status quo, and that's what has the European centre so nervous. For me, the real challenge is not how to preserve that centre, but how to harness the anger and the alienation of those left behind by the political centre into a progressive movement for positive social, economic and political change. So to conclude, Chair, just a few brief remarks. I think we are living at a moment of enormous opportunity Not a moment when we should be fearful, but where we should be searching out and exploring those opportunities. And I genuinely believe that the moment that we're in has the potential to represent a turning point away from the failed political socio-economic consensus of the past. But that's dependent on what those of us who want to see that kind of change in our society and what we do in the coming period. And I think we have a responsibility to map out a real alternative based on principles of liberty, of equality and solidarity. And of course, and I suppose every speech by a politician ends with this reference this year, but that doesn't mean that those of us who do it don't mean it sincerely. But 100 years ago, a small group of radicals sensed that they too were living in a turning point in history. They combined street protest with anarchic flouting of the law. They fragmented the political landscape, and they disrupted what some people thought was stable and effective government. And in doing so, they changed the course of the history of this nation. And in my view, they did so for the better. There is a certain irony that many politicians who most loudly celebrate and commemorate that anarchic flouting of the law oppose it in the present and want to see a restoration of the political status quo that has done this part of our country so much damage. But I, for one, see that as an opportunity. And I think the more we see people engaging in politics and mobilising and organising in whatever way they see fit for real, profound social, economic and political change in our country, then I think the crisis and the trauma and the tragedy that we've all experienced for the last number of years will end up actually creating and motivating a better and more equal society for all. Thank you.